Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
When I moved into that old Victorian house with my two roommates, we were thrilled. The place had character, gorgeous crown molding, bay windows, and an actual fireplace. Sure, it was divided into three separate apartments, but our ground floor unit was spacious enough for the three of us. I work as a hospital lab technician. My shifts can start at 6 a.m., which means I'm up by 4:30 most mornings. My roommates work regular 9 to 5 jobs, but they respect my schedule. We've always been considerate of each other. It's just common sense when you share a living space. Everything was perfect for the first 8 months. Then both the upstairs and downstairs tenants moved out within weeks of each other. The downstairs folks were replaced by a quiet retired couple, but the upstairs apartment, that's where my nightmare began. One night I came home from my evening shift to find a parade of guys hauling furniture up the stairs. By my count, there were at least 6 of them moving into a 4-bedroom apartment. The landlord had mentioned renting it to a few students, but this looked more like a small fraternity. That first night, the stomping and music kept me awake until 3 a.m. I had to be up in an hour and a half for work. I went through my shift like a zombie. The next day, my roommates and I decided to be proactive. We went upstairs, knocked on their door, and introduced ourselves. The guy who answered seemed friendly enough. I greeted them and introduced myself and my roommates as their downstairs neighbors, explaining that we wanted to welcome them to the building. The main tenant introduced himself as the primary renter and gestured to the others as his roommates. Several guys waved from the living room, which was already cluttered with empty pizza boxes and beer cans. I explained about the terrible soundproofing in the building and how we could hear almost everything. The main tenant apologized and promised they would keep the noise down. My roommate added that we were fine with weekend noise, but weeknights were difficult, especially since one of us had to be at work by 6 a.m. The upstairs guy said he understood completely and agreed that weeknights would be quiet while weekends could be a bit louder. He said it sounded fair to him. They seemed so reasonable. I actually felt good about the conversation as we headed back downstairs. That lasted exactly 2 days. Tuesday night, thumping bass until 2 a.m. Wednesday, some kind of drinking game that involved jumping and shouting. Thursday, what sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor at midnight. We tried everything. Notes on their door, texts to the number the main tenant had given us, ceiling banging with a broom handle, a second then third face-to-face conversation. Each time they'd apologize and promise to keep it down. Each time the noise would resume within days, sometimes hours. After 3 weeks of sleep deprivation, I contacted our landlord. He gave them a warning. Things improved for 4 days, then back to the same old noise. I started documenting everything. Dates, times, types of disturbances. When we hit the 1-month mark of this torture, I went upstairs for one final attempt at civility. I told them that I had been really patient, but this had gone too far, and that I hadn't had a full night's sleep in a month. The upstairs guy rolled his eyes and complained that they were just living their lives, and it wasn't their fault the building had thin walls. I reminded him that I had explained multiple times about my early morning work schedule and that this wasn't about thin walls. It was about basic consideration. He asked sarcastically what I wanted them to do, tiptoe around their own apartment. I replied that I simply wanted them not to blast music at 1 a.m. on a Tuesday and asked if that was really so unreasonable. Another guy from the living room shouted that maybe I should get some earplugs, which made them all laugh as if they'd made the most original joke in the world. Finally, I warned them that next time I would call the police, since noise ordinances exist for a reason. The main tenant snorted and said good luck with that, adding that he was sure the cops had nothing better to do than respond to my little noise complaint. As they closed the door in my face, I heard more laughter. The following Monday, I was coming home from my late shift when I spotted a guy I recognized from the hospital heading toward the upstairs apartment with cash in hand. He quickly pocketed it when he saw me, looking nervous. That's when it clicked. The constant parade of visitors. The weird smells, the paranoid way they always checked who was at the door before opening it. They weren't just noisy neighbors, they were dealing drugs from the apartment. As if on cue, that very night the bass started thumping at 11 p.m. By midnight, it sounded like a full-blown party. I could smell smoke seeping through the vents, and not the tobacco kind. I called the non-emergency police line. I reported the noise disturbance and mentioned that it had been an ongoing issue for over a month. When the dispatcher asked if there was anything else they should know, I mentioned the strong smell of MJ and the visitors coming and going at all hours. The dispatcher said they would send a patrol car shortly. When the police car arrived about an hour later, I went outside to meet them. 3 officers had come, unusual for a simple noise complaint. I thanked the officer for coming and told him that their doorbell was broken, but mentioned there was a stairway in the back leading directly to their balcony. The officer nodded, and I went back inside, positioning myself by the window with a perfect view of the parking lot. One officer stayed at the front door, while the other 2 went around back. A minute later, the music abruptly stopped. Then chaos erupted. People came flying out windows. Backpacks were being thrown into the bushes. The officer at the front door was physically blocking people trying to escape. I watched as one guy tried to shimmy down a drain pipe and fell flat on his back. Within minutes, more police cars arrived, 5 in total, including 2 large vans. I counted 12 people being led out in handcuffs. After things calmed down, I went outside and approached the officer I'd spoken with earlier. I told him that I didn't know what happened up there, but that I had noticed some backpacks being thrown into the bushes over in those areas. I pointed to the exact spots where I'd seen bags land. The officers searched the area and recovered several backpacks, all stuffed with what I assumed were illegal substances. The next day, only 2 of the original tenants returned, looking subdued and considerably less smug. I saw them hauling out damaged furniture and cleaning supplies. When they spotted me, they quickly looked away. That night was the quietest I'd experienced in months. I slept straight through until my alarm, feeling more rested than I had in weeks. Over the next few days, I learned from the landlord that most of the group had been arrested on drug charges. The main tenant and 1 other were allowed to stay, but were now on probation with the landlord. 1 more complaint, and they'd be evicted. For the remaining months I lived there, I never had to complain about noise again. Let me start by saying that I've been in a wheelchair for about 7 years now. A car accident left me with partial paralysis in my lower body, and while I've made huge strides in physical therapy, I still rely on my wheelchair to get around independently. My wheelchair isn't just some piece of equipment, it's my freedom. I saved up for months to get this specific model because it's lightweight, easy to maneuver, and fits perfectly in my car. It gives me the independence to go shopping, meet friends, and live my life without constantly depending on others. Last Saturday, I decided to treat myself to some retail therapy at the local mall. It had been a rough week at work, and I just wanted to browse some stores and maybe grab a coffee. The mall was busy as usual on weekends, but I'm pretty good at navigating through crowds. I was taking a short break near the fountain in the center of the mall, checking my phone for any messages, when I noticed a woman approaching me. She was probably in her 40s, dressed head to toe in what looked like expensive clothes, with a large purse that probably cost more than my monthly rent. At first, I thought maybe she needed directions or was going to ask if I needed help. Some people still assume everyone in a wheelchair needs assistance, but what came out of her mouth left me completely stunned. The woman asked if she could borrow my wheelchair for a bit. She complained that her feet were killing her after all her shopping, and she didn't feel like walking anymore. I actually laughed at first, thinking she was joking, but her expression remained dead serious. I asked her to repeat herself, not believing what I'd heard. She clarified that she wanted to use my wheelchair because she'd been shopping all day, and her heels were uncomfortable. I politely explained that I couldn't let her use my wheelchair because it was necessary for me to get around. I told her it wasn't a toy or prop for when someone felt tired, but an essential device for my daily life. Her face changed immediately. First came the shock dash, like she couldn't believe I was refusing her request. Then quickly shifted to anger. She pointed out how expensive her shoes were and complained about walking for hours. I told her that while I understood she was tired, this was my mobility device, and I literally couldn't walk without it. She argued that I was just sitting there doing nothing while she needed to visit several more stores. She suggested I could wait for a while. I could feel people starting to look our way, which made me incredibly uncomfortable. I hate being the center of attention, especially when it involves my disability. I refused again, explaining that this was my wheelchair, and I needed it. I suggested she use one of the mall's benches if she needed to rest. She became very angry, raising her voice and calling me selfish. She insisted that because she was tired, I should give her my wheelchair. Her voice was getting louder with each word. People were definitely staring now. I tried to end the conversation, asking her to leave me alone. Instead of walking away, she actually grabbed one of the handles of my wheelchair and tried to pull it backward. I gripped my wheels to stop her and felt a surge of panic. I yelled at her to stop and let go, asking what she thought she was doing. She dismissed my concerns as being dramatic, insisting she only needed the wheelchair for 30 minutes and that I could clearly wait. She actually started trying to push me out of my own wheelchair, putting her hands on my shoulders. I was terrified and shocked that this was happening in a crowded mall in broad daylight. I called out for help. A man who had been watching the situation unfold finally stepped in. He confronted the woman and demanded she get her hands off me. The woman told him to mind his own business and claimed I was being unreasonable. The bystander pointed out that she was trying to take someone's wheelchair, which was assault. By this point, a small crowd had gathered, and thankfully, a security guard noticed the commotion and came over. When asked what was happening, the woman immediately launched into her version before I could explain. She complained that she had just asked to borrow the wheelchair for a few minutes because her feet hurt, and I was being completely selfish about it. The looks on the faces of the security guard and bystanders said it all. The guard explained to her that she couldn't take someone's wheelchair, comparing it to taking crutches from someone with a broken leg. The woman insisted it was different because I was just sitting there. The security guard called for backup, and the mall manager arrived shortly after. After hearing both sides, the manager told the woman that she needed to leave immediately or they would call the police. The woman became indignant, insisting she was a paying customer who spent thousands of dollars in the mall. They would be calling the police. The woman's face went pale when she realized they were serious. The police arrived within minutes, and after interviewing me and several witnesses, they arrested her for attempted theft and assault. I decided to press charges because what she did wasn't just entitled, it was dangerous. What if she had succeeded in pushing me out? I could have been injured falling to the ground. The whole incident left me shaken for days afterward. I keep replaying it in my mind. In the end, I found out she was charged with attempted robbery and assault. According to the police, she had no prior record but would likely face community service and a fine. I've been a computer numerical control machinist for nearly 8 years now. Got into it after technical school when I realized I had a knack for precision work, always been good with my hands and understanding how things fit together. About 3 years ago, I landed a job at this manufacturing company that makes specialized medical equipment. The base component I create on my CNC machine is the foundation for everything else. We're talking about a precision-cut aluminum housing that requires perfect tolerances. Without it, the rest of the assembly team can't do their jobs. My daily routine was pretty straightforward. Each piece takes exactly 3 hours to complete from setup to final inspection. I'd make one in the morning, take my coffee break, make the second one, take lunch, and then start the third. That third one would finish after my shift ended at 4:30, so I'd stay until about 6:30 to complete it. The company was happy with the arrangement since they got 3 parts daily, and I was happy with the overtime pay. Things were running smoothly until we got this new foreman. From day one, I could tell he had something to prove. He'd constantly hover around my station, making comments about how I should be multitasking during production runs. The foreman suggested I could be sweeping the floor while the machine was running instead of just watching it. I explained that these parts require constant monitoring and that even one vibration or temperature change could ruin the entire piece. He didn't like that answer and went complaining to the plant manager. Thankfully, the plant manager understood the value of what I was making. The plant manager told the foreman to leave me alone, explaining that those parts were worth more than what they paid me in a week, and if I said I needed to monitor the machine, then that's what I should do. The foreman backed off for a while, but I could tell he was just waiting for an opportunity to assert his authority. That opportunity came during a brutal snowstorm in January. The roads were terrible. Accidents everywhere, plows couldn't keep up. I left my house 40 minutes early but still ended up clocking in 10 minutes late. When I walked through the door, there he was, looking like he'd just won the lottery. The foreman smugly remarked about my late arrival. He was holding a demerit slip, already filled out. Turns out I had clocked in 1 minute late the previous week when the time clock was running fast. According to company policy, 2 late arrivals within 14 days meant 20 demerit points. I protested, pointing out that there was a state of emergency outside. The foreman simply stated that rules were rules and I was late. Our union steward happened to be walking by and came over to see what the commotion was about. After I explained, the union steward sighed and shook his head. He regretfully told me that the contract was clear on this matter and I would have to take the demerits. I took the slip, put it in my shirt pocket, and went to my station. I worked as usual, made my first part, took my break, made my second part, and took lunch. When the third part was about halfway done, I looked at the clock. 4:30 exactly. I shut down the machine, grabbed my jacket, and left. The next morning, the foreman came storming over to my station. He demanded to know why the assembly team didn't get their third part yesterday. I replied that nothing happened and that I was working on today's first part, which would be done in about 2 hours. The foreman pressed about the team needing 3 parts daily and asked why I didn't make 3 yesterday. I simply stated that my shift ends at 4:30 and I went home at that time. When he exclaimed that I always stay until the third part is finished, I pulled the demerit slip from my pocket, held it up, and told him that would no longer be the case. The foreman's face went from red to purple. He stormed off, probably to complain to the plant manager. Over the next few days, the production line started backing up. Instead of 15 parts a week, I was producing 10 or 11. The assembly team had no core components to work with, so they were just standing around. They actually didn't mind. More time to chat and less pressure to hit quotas. About a week later, I was called into a meeting with the plant manager, the foreman, and the union steward. The plant manager looked stressed and asked what was going on with production. Before I could answer, the foreman interrupted, accusing me of refusing to work overtime and deliberately slowing down production. I responded that I wasn't refusing anything but simply working my scheduled hours, 8 to 4:30, as per my contract. The union steward confirmed this, explaining that according to our contract, mandatory overtime was only applicable in emergency situations, which this was not, and that I had every right to decline overtime. The foreman lost his temper at that point. He accused me of sabotage and trying to make him look bad, questioning why I suddenly decided to follow the contract to the letter after years of working overtime. When the plant manager told him to calm down, the foreman refused, claiming everyone was against him. The plant manager suggested he step outside to collect himself. After the foreman stormed out, the plant manager looked at me with a tired expression and asked what it would take to get me to work overtime again. I smiled and told him that as long as that man was my supervisor, I wouldn't be working a minute of overtime. 2 days later, I came in to find a new foreman. The old one had been transferred to another facility across town. The new foreman was a quiet guy who kept to himself and barely talked to anyone except when necessary. The plant manager told me he had a long chat with my new foreman, who understood his primary job was to make sure I had everything I needed and to otherwise stay out of my way. I worked the next 2 Saturdays at double-time pay to help catch up with the backlog. It cost the company thousands in premium pay and delayed deliveries, but they learned a lesson. Following the rules to the letter can be the best form of protest sometimes when dealing with entitled people who use those same rules against you. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.